You've likely heard of aggro, control, and mid-range decks, but what do these terms mean exactly? And did you know that there are even more sub-archetypes within these? In Disney Lorcana, like other trading card games, there are different types of deck archetypes you can build and play. In this video, we're going to cover the different types of decks, their playstyles, and their strengths and weaknesses. So let's go. Deck archetypes describe the overall goal and style of play of a deck. That is, how the deck is trying to win. A lot of these terminologies come from other, longer established TCGs, like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, and many more. And for those new to TCGs, the terms can be quite intimidating and often not that clear. But at a high level, there are three main deck archetypes. These are aggro, mid-range, and control, although there is a lot of diversity within these. Let's take a deeper look at each of the three main deck archetypes, starting with aggro. The term aggro is derived from the fact these decks want to be playing aggressively, questing as fast as they can, and so will feature a high number of low-cost, high-questing cards, such as Daisy Duck Donald's Date or Curse Merfolk Ursula's Handiwork. The goal of aggro decks are to apply pressure and reach 20 lore before opposing decks are able to respond to their overwhelming numbers. The downside is that aggro decks sacrifice their strength in the later game in order to prioritize their speed early on. You'll see that in the distribution of card costs, with lots of 1 and 2 cost characters and fewer higher cost characters. Aggro decks are great for players who prefer a foot on the gas approach to playing, either winning or losing quickly. It's also a good deck choice if you prefer to demand answers from your opponent rather than trying to answer your opponent's board. Because the strategy is more straightforward, aggro decks can be a great pick for newer players, but there is still plenty of skill expression in these decks, and they're played by some of the most skilled players too. Control decks are the next type of deck we're going to look at. The goal of a control deck is to play a more attrition style game, whittling down their opponent's resources until they're able to close out the game with their more powerful cards. The gameplay is much slower, attempting to respond to opponent threats as efficiently as possible before deploying their own to close out the game. Control decks will do this by playing removal actions such as Be King Undisputed or Be Prepared. These types of actions are there to remove threats and ideally look to maximize their value. A well-timed Be Prepared can lead to card advantage, a concept that we cover in our TCG Fundamentals video, which we'll link below. Some characters may also provide removal when they're played, such as Madame Medusa the Boss or Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, or they may even rush in and deal immediate damage like Maui Demigod. Control may further use tools that exert your characters to prevent them from questing, like Elsa's Spirit of Winter, or actions like I'm Stuck. Once the game is under control, these decks will then deploy their win condition. Cards like Tamatoa So Shiny, Maui Half Shark, or Lucky Dime to quickly close out the game. And as you see, the ink cost distribution of control decks is much higher, favouring higher cost cards that outvalue their opponent's cards. Control decks are great for players who prefer slower, more complex decks which reward patient and strategic play. They're also a good deck choice if you prefer answering your opponent's board, rather than demanding answers yourself. The third of the main 3 deck archetypes is mid-range. Mid-range decks are a balance between aggro and control. As the name suggests, mid-range decks look to win more in the mid-game and can switch focus from controlling the early game before taking a more aggressive role in the mid-game. They have the flexibility of being able to play a reactive, attrition-based game against aggro decks and a more proactive, aggressive game against control decks. A card like Beast Tragic Hero is a good example of a mid-range card, where his cost means he's typically only starting to generate value from turn 4 or 5 onwards. And Steel Song is a typical mid-range deck, employing low-cost characters like Daisy Duck we might see in an aggro deck, but also characters like Prince Naveen who are more in the mid-range territory. And typically Steel decks will fall into the mid-range category, as their removal is more efficient early game against low willpower characters. Let the Storm Rage On and Fire the Cannon will be much less efficient against later game characters. Mid-range decks may often make use of tools that disrupt their opponent, with cards like Bare Necessities and Judy Hopps to dismantle potential game plans. The ink cost distribution of a mid-range deck is, unsurprisingly, more focused around the mid-game, favouring a more traditional bell curve of costs, centred around the 3 to 4 cost mark. But mid-range decks can be built more aggressive or more control too. Mid-range decks are great for players who enjoy a flexible playstyle, adapting quickly to their opponent. They also reward players who can most efficiently use their resources. One of the interesting dynamics of the different deck types is that there is a natural rock paper scissors relationship based on the way these decks are constructed. Aggro decks often beat control decks, as they're able to apply early cost-efficient lore pressure control decks simply can't respond to. Control decks on the other hand make use of stronger top-end cards than mid-range decks, which outvalue their opponent's cards. Finally, midrange decks are able to access their efficient early game removal and disruption tools to shut down aggro decks before they can race ahead. Of course, these aren't solid rules, but give you a general idea of the dynamics you'll face depending on your deck choice. Outside of the main 3 archetypes, there are a number of sub-archetypes. Tempo decks are one of the most common subtype in Disney Lorcana. While in some TCGs the term tempo and midrange are used interchangeably, in Disney Lorcana, tempo decks sit somewhere between aggro and midrange. Tempo decks will often have early aggro threats, but also have tools to affect the tempo of their opponent, a term generally used to refer to the player's momentum toward their win condition, either through characters or effects that return characters to their opponent's hand like Kick Cloud Kicker, or characters that can make favourable trades like Madam Mim Fox. Ramp decks are another sub-archetype. These decks look to accelerating to reach their late game cards sooner, something colloquially referred to as ramping. This is a term borrowed from Magic the Gathering, specifically referring to the card Rampant Growth, which has a similar effect to Disney Lorcana's One Jump Ahead. Cards like Tipo Growing Sun do this by adding an extra card to the inkwell, while an item like Lantern can do this by reducing the cost of character cards. Lore gain decks make use of effects that provide lore directly, without the need to quest. These include cards such as Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, or Merlin Goat. You may hear these types of decks being called burn decks, which is a term taken from Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! In those games, instead of lore, players are removing life points from each other, often with fire-based spells, hence the term burn. While any deck archetype may use lore gaining effects, these lore gain decks are defined by this being their primary win condition. Combo decks utilize a specific combination of cards to achieve victory, typically looking to set these up and then close the game in a single turn. These decks will often look to control the early game to assemble the cards necessary before executing on its plan. Jafar Striking Illusionist and Whole New World is an example of a combo deck, looking to set up Jafar to be able to then gain large lore gains from his effect. Right now we don't see that many combo decks in Disney Lorcana, but as the card pool increases, it's likely we'll see the emergence of these powerful combo decks in the future. Prison decks aim to create situations where their opponent is unable to regain momentum in a game, essentially creating a lock. Like combo decks, they look to set up a specific set of cards, but rather than winning in a single turn, they instead slowly grind their way to victory by denying their opponent the ability to play cards or even keep their characters on the board. A version of Emerald Steel used the Muse's ability to return characters back to their hand when a song is played, and paired this with discard songs such as Sudden Chill to slowly whittle down their opponent's hand, while also preventing their characters from staying on board. Removing resources this way essentially created a lock on their opponent, who were unable to get back into the game. Mill decks are an interesting sub-archetype which, instead of trying to win a game by reaching 20 lore, employ an alternate win condition, making their opponent run out of cards in their deck. The term mill derives from the card Millstone in Magic the Gathering. Much like Lorcana's A Very Merry Birthday, sees the opponent put the top 2 cards of their deck into their discard. As of Lorcana's 6th set, a truly viable mill deck has yet to emerge, but as more cards are added to support this archetype, it's very likely that we will see a mill deck in the near future. And that's our brief overview of the different deck archetypes in Disney Lorcana. If you found this video useful, be sure to hit the like button on your way out, and subscribe for future videos. And let us know down in the comment what your favourite archetype is. Finally, a huge shout out to SH41 for their input on this video. Now, until next time, happy questing.